hello again, those who are here, and hello to those who are listening to the recording. And today we are having part 3 of Lithuanian heritage and culture course. And this was announced as an open lecture. At first it wasn't, but after a while I decided I will open it to people who want to learn more, because this topic attracted very different opinions, and there were people who got very angry for one reason or another, because uh, the topic of the history of Lithuanian language, when it came to be, how it formed, uh, it kind of has a lot of information floating around all over the internet, all over social media, in the communities where people are interested in Lithuanian culture and topics related to that. And a lot of that information is inaccurate, and we'll try to talk about that actually today, where all that comes from, and well, why people are so angry when you try to contradict that. That's another question, but we'll not get into that much today. But we'll talk about the latest um, the latest knowledge on what researchers, linguists think about the formation of languages and the formation of Lithuanian language, and how and when approximately it could have formed, and what could have been the process. And you'll notice that I will not use definitive statements like it definitely is like that, or it's undeniable, because in humanitarian sciences, in this type of research, we never know for sure. So we'll try to talk about that too a little bit later. So first thing that I want to talk about is that actually there are a lot of opinions, and of course some opinions will just be friendly, arguments between researchers of maybe this process happened like that, or this process happened the other way. But it's usually, done in an academic environment where people just publish their articles, and that's that, and then after a while, people settle on some, predominant opinion, and that's how it goes. But of course, as I said, there are a lot of opinions that formed in the communities that are interested in Lithuanian culture, heritage, history, etc. Typically, the communities of people who have Lithuanian roots, and sometimes people don't want to hear the academic approach, actually, and they feel that this somehow discredits their Lithuanian roots or Lithuanian heritage. And well, that's a little bit of a problem. So as I said, if someone says that something is undeniable, this is what one of my professors says. He said that if someone tells you that this is how it definitely happened, you need to start doubting them immediately. Like, this person might not be telling the truth. So there are things that we don't know for sure, and we will never probably know for sure. We just use scientific methods that help us to understand how it could have worked. And well, a lot of times in the beginning phase, it's guesswork, and only after a while people manage to find the methods that could back those guesses up. So I think that we need to start with some background. So the first thing that we should think about when we talk about language as a process, as as a process in the human race, as the thing that connects us, is why do we need it? And of course, there are functions of language that are kind of set, that these are the functions that language helps us acquire, but you will always see communication at the top of the list. We need to share ideas, we need to exchange our thoughts, so we communicate. And of course, there are other functions like expressing ourselves, etc., etc. But on the very top, there is always going to be communication. And kind of, even if we list the whole 5 or 6 that are usually listed, we can kind of connect them to communication on some level. But I think that it's worth saying that language is not only a tool, it's also something that kind of locks in the cultural experience of the nation. And if you learn the language, if you study it, if you research it, you'll see that there are many cultural things hidden in the language itself. And Lithuanian is one of the languages that probably managed to keep quite a lot of that, to keep quite a lot of those hidden meanings in the words, in the civics, etc. Now, of course, as I mentioned already, there are a lot of myths floating around. You know, that this is the oldest language in the world, this is the oldest language in Europe, etc., etc. You know, people say different things about it, and they start arguing with each other with who is right and who is wrong. But I wanted to start from the myths so that later we can kind of go to the more exact information. So one of the myths that I have heard and have seen floating around recently, like in the past year, is that, for example, well, this is an example, 5,000 years, but it's one variation or another of this, that Lithuanians spoke the same language 5,000 years ago, and that we could understand our ancestors from 5,000 years ago if we listen to them talk. So if you go to, you know, any uh, zoology department or linguistics department, uh, professors will probably say, okay, so I will give you to read a Lithuanian text from 16th century and let me know how much you understand. That's probably what you would be told. But actually, where does it come from? This thinking that 5,000 or 2,000 years ago, people spoke the same language. So one of the heroes of the story is someone called Theodore Thurston. And actually, the legend, and I consciously use this word legend, is that there was this linguist who researched Lithuanian language, and that his article was published in New York Times. And this version of this text is floating around the internet for probably 20 years already. And it says that Lithuanian language, whatever its antiquity, is of a wonderful structure, more perfect than either Sanskrit or Greek, etc., etc. And what is interesting, it says, so strong is this affinity that any philologist can see very clearly that Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin must have sprung from a common source, Lithuanian. So if you had any contact with linguistics, you'll see that something is wrong here, because how can you say that all these languages sprung from Lithuanian? But this is, you know, what the text says. And it's been shared in Lithuanian, in English, all around the online communities. And there was only one try of contradicting it. And it was actually in the States, where someone from Draugas paper published and kind of an article saying that, okay, people, look, this is what happened. So the thing is that there was never an article with this text published in New York Times. And if you would check, there was no such article, basically. And I don't know who created that legend, how it came to be that it was, but it wasn't. The actual story is that supposedly there was this Theodore Thurston who has written a book about Lithuanian language in 1941 and published it. And the thing is that this guy was a thief and he picked up portions of different texts from different authors and adapted them. And this version of this text is nothing else than a result of, stealing the text and changing it. And he is talking here about Proto-Aryan, something like that. It's really strange when you read about it. But if you want to romanticize things, then you could say that, okay, look, this was this great thing about Lithuanian language. And I'm not saying that Lithuanian language is not great. No, definitely not. But it is great on some other senses that we'll discuss today. But this is just basically a load of nonsense. And now, this is the original version of this text. That was created by William Jones, who was actually a historian and a linguist. And he was talking about Sanskrit. The Sanskrit language, whatever it be, its antiquity, is of a wonderful structure. And actually, if you read the text, you'll see that he doesn't say that other languages came from Sanskrit. He says that they must have had common source that doesn't exist anymore. And well, that's the modern opinion, actually. So he was right. And when we talk about the history of linguistics, we'll definitely need to mention William Jones because he had some good ideas. So he was kind of a good guy in the area of research. So basically, this is the original, and this is where this Theodore Thurston supposedly took the text from, although besides that, no one can find anything about him. Did he exist? No one actually knows. It's just that there was this book. That's it. So actually, I still cannot understand, honestly, how this one fake article managed to be so well spread all over the communities, both here in Lithuania and Lithuanian communities abroad. But I think that this worked quite well in the sense of creating the myths. And of course, there are more things that kind of probably started from that point. But this is, this is still being shared, and people still believe it. So, as we stopped with William Jones, I think it's a good point to start the actual lecture, because if we think about linguistics and the research of languages, of course, people had different ideas from the oldest of times about languages, about how they were formed. And at some points, they thought they are separate. Then they started seeing that there are languages that have more similarities between themselves than with other languages. And they started thinking, okay, they must be somehow related. They must come from the same family, etc., etc. So throughout the time, the beliefs were changing, and some ideas stayed, and some ideas kept changing. And this is where comparative linguistics come into picture, because this was the breaking point. When they started actually comparing the languages, they saw that, okay, this is interesting. We need to have some more research done, because there is some, curious things happening. And actually, 18th century was around the time the same century when William Jones had that speech about Sanskrit and the whole culture. He studied the cultures in India, and so similarities between languages were noticed. And throughout the time, this theory of Indo-European language family kind of was put together. I will not go into, very small details of who has done what and when, but just some basic points. So basically, it was kind of decided that there was this whole language family that connected them. And of course, we'll see later that there are quite a lot of language families all around the world, but in the European family connects the languages in Europe and where they originally come from. So languages in Europe and also in I'm thinking how it's called in English. 1 second. The area of where India is, Hindustan Peninsula, I guess. Yes. So that region, although they have some other languages there too, not only in the European. And I'll try to show you how that could have happened, that the languages in these two regions, in South Asia and in Europe, are connected. And as we are looking at this tree, actually, which relates us to genealogy, and this is actually interesting that we can look at languages in this kind of when thinking in this approach of having a tree, kind of a genealogical tree. Similarly, language tree, that languages branch from each other, only that we don't know what those three languages were anymore. And in this tree of languages, we also see one smaller. Next to the bigger one, we see a smaller tree. So I just wanted to point it out that Estonian, although it is considered a Baltic country now, it's not a Baltic language. It comes from Finnish branch of the Finno-Ugric language family. Okay, so now if we look at the bigger tree, you will see that there are two main branches in the Iranian and European. So if you travel up through the European branch, and there is a little cat, so that's why I think this tree is fun, because it has cats on it. So if you follow the cat, above the cat's head, you'll see that there is a small Baltic branch. There were more Baltic languages, but among the existing ones, we have two, Lithuanian and Latvian. So, and now let's continue. So I mentioned that there are more language families. For example, they could be Afroasiatic, the Ugric, as I mentioned. The Estonian is a good example, also Finnish, etc., etc. Turkic, Sino-Tibetan, and other language families. So we will not talk about them, but just so we can imagine how it works. The current number of languages that's calculated today is 7,170. And we can always check on the website ethnologue.com how many languages they have right now. So that will not only include verbal languages, but also sign languages and, all types of languages that exist. In Lithuania, if you zoom to Lithuania, in the territory of Lithuania, they have marked 4. So it's Lithuanian Sign Language, it's Karaim in Trakai, and also Samogitian. So we'll come back to Samogitian a little bit later. So this is the map, and they have 4 languages marked here. Now, of course, if we think how the Lithuanian language came to be, there are different hypotheses. So I will give you the basic picture, but if you want to dive deeper, you will be able to read about those different opinions that researchers had or still have. And as in any area of research, you will find different options, and you can think which one makes more sense to me. And of course, as we cannot say for sure, there is no reason to argue or anything. It's just, we can just learn more and more. So the idea is this, that based on archaeological findings and on the linguistics, and lastly, genetics, because of the DNA testing getting more and more extensive, all the different types of DNA tests and the remains that have been uncovered being tested, we can have more exact facts. So the idea is this, that it is considered that tribes that we now call Indo-European, they started moving from the steppes north from the Black Sea, and they kind of started spreading. And there were several waves of the moving, but the idea is that they must have had a common language. And we don't know what language was that, only that now we can call it Proto-Indo-European. And of course, we don't have any actual sources for that, and only reconstruction of the words that is done by comparing words in different languages that seem to come from the same root. So this is how it works. So actually, this idea was widely backed up by one of the most famous Lithuanian archaeologists who worked in the United States, Marija Gimbutas. Although now some researchers think that maybe her views are already a little bit old-fashioned, etc. Maybe we have more exact information, but it kind of coincides with this theory that we usually talk about when we talk about the language formation, that people came from there. And she was talking about Kurgan culture, that there were people who were burying the dead in these special mounds. So the graves were kind of mounds that are called kurgans, and based on the archaeological findings, that's how they tried to kind of decide approximately at which periods those waves of moving happened. If we look at the linguistic data, we'll see that there are quite a lot of words that seem to share the roots in different languages. So we have mother, we have motina in Lithuanian, we have madre in Spanish, we have mat in Russian, and mate in Latvian. So I tried to pick words from different language families, branches, let's say. Then again, number 2, Lithuanian d, Spanish dos, dva in Russian, and dive in Latvian. And you might say, how are D and D related? It's the same root, it's just that there were some phonetic processes going on. Brother, brolis, brat, bralis. So you can see that there are same sounds in those words, it's just that they were altered when they spread. And basically, in a nutshell, this is how it is done. Of course, the process is more complicated, but the words are compared, and then researchers, they try to decide which sounds were the original ones. And there are even these laws of phonetics that were kind of established that between different languages, this sound was changed to this. So if, for example, in Lithuanian, we have the sound O, then in Latvian, we have some specific sound, for example, that means the same thing. So in this case, it's long A. So this is how it works. This is the complicated part. I don't need to go into that, just so that you get an idea. So as I said, these conclusions are made by putting together knowledge from linguistics, archaeology, anthropology, and the science of genetics. So when did that migration happen? So it is thought that it must have started 4,000 to 3,000 years before Christ, before our era. So, well, if the migration only started around that time, so let's say 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, it's safe to say that Lithuanians didn't speak Lithuanian 5,000 years ago because there was no Lithuanians. And as I said, there were several waves of moving until those tribes reached the area that we now know as Lithuania. So it was quite a lot later during that time. Another idea of Marija Gimbuta's was that the locals in the old Europe were peaceful pickers. They were not fighters. They just lived there and that's it. And that in the Europeans were these warriors who brought a completely different culture to the old Europe. Now, this fact is backed up by some researchers, but other researchers think that maybe it wasn't that true. We cannot say. Marija Gimbutas thought that, based on archaeological findings, that that old culture was matristic. So not it wasn't matriarchy. It was matristic culture that respected women a lot, and it was a completely different approach to life, and that there was no. She thought there was no reason to say that they were fighting or there were wars or etc. So, well, that was her idea of how it was, but we cannot say that it was actually like that. But in the Europeans, well, we can say for sure that they were warriors and they brought some contrast probably to the areas. And of course, those tribes, they didn't stay in one place, they didn't move together. So they scatter across Europe, South Asia, and later, of course, the Americas. And but that was a lot later. But in the beginning, there were some part of those old tribes that we don't know how they're called, that supposedly moved to South Asia and others to Europe. And it is thought that the tribes that we can call proto-Balts reached this area around 3,000 to 2,000 years before Christ, and that's when the Proto-Baltic dialects were formed. So it is thought that maybe in the beginning there was Proto-Baltic. So before that we had Proto-Indo-European, then we had Proto-Baltic, and then Baltic dialects in the beginning. And those Baltic dialects, when they were spreading around, they kind of formed into languages, and that's how Baltic tribes were formed. So at this point, I want to make an interjection a little bit and just mention a few things about what we know about Baltic religion, just a few facts not a lot. We could talk about that for a long time, not just one meeting. But before we move on talking about how and what tribes were formed, let's mention Baltic religion. Of course, the most knowledge that we have about Baltic religion comes from Lithuanian and Prussian background, but we can think that the philosophy was similar in other tribes too. So, of course, the most important thing would be the connection to nature. That's that we can see that in the old, gods and goddesses. We can see that in what we know about the old religion. There is also this idea that although we kind of think that reincarnation comes from southern areas, from Hinduism, from Buddhism, but actually it is thought that people believe in some type of reincarnation. Maybe not exactly how we imagine it. That comes from the uh, from from the east, from South Asia, but still. And also, one of the main things that we typically think about Baltic religion is that there were a lot of gods. So what I have been reading now is that researchers think that the reason why Christianity settled finally here is because, well, one reason is that they tried to apply the new faith to the existing uh, traditions and festivals. But another thing is that the idea of one God wasn't unfamiliar to people. It's just that they believed in more gods that later adapted to things. But the main one God uh, was actually an idea that was practiced, that there is the Father God or the Old Man God, the God that created us. So this idea wasn't new. And actually, if we talk about it, the thing is that we don't have original written sources. We have sources that come from enemies, basically, people who were looking at Baltic people as to these pagans that didn't know anything, and they were, these cruel tribes that had believed in this ancient form of religion, outdated, etc., etc. So basically, one of the main sources is still mythology. There are remains of the old um, approach to life in folk art and folk songs and tales and etc. Of course, they were adapted during the Christian times, but we still see the remain. So I just wanted to paint a little picture about what Baltic people might have believed in. And again, we will never know for sure. Now we have these neo pagan traditions, sometimes they're called like that, or we could say people who are trying to revive the old Baltic religion and tradition. Um, I guess the safest way to look at it would be to try and research as much as we can, but maybe as a form of understanding the old belief system and a form of understanding how people felt life and how they saw life. Because no matter our faith or religion, it's still in our roots, how people felt nature, each other, the natural forces, etc. So, and now let's continue with the Balts. So those Baltic tribes. Basically, this title, The Balts, it was created by Georg Nesselmann in 1845. So before that, there wasn't a common name that would be used to call the people who lived in this area. The first mention of what is thought were those tribes was in the 1st century by Tacitus, and it said Astorum gentes. So in Lithuanian we use this word aiščiai. Basically, this was kind of the old name that was used, but it wasn't common. How they call themselves, we don't know. Maybe they didn't have a common name, but we group all the tribes now as the Balts. The territory, sometimes we imagine it was kind of narrow, but actually it is thought now that it might have reached the Isla River, Pripyat in Ukraine, Dnieper River, and even Moscow. So if you look at this map, this is what is thought at the moment, that the darker area was the main area where Baltic people must have lived. And I say must have lived. Why? The thing is that the names of towns, villages, etc., they were altered all the time based on the political regime, etc., etc. But the names of the water sources, rivers, and lakes, they weren't altered that much. And actually, linguists are doing the research of the names of the rivers, etc., etc., and they are making conclusions based on those names that they seem to be of Baltic origin. So the lighter blue area is the peripheral area that they think that also Baltic people might have reached, but it's not that definite. But it's still, the surrounding area that was affected by Baltic tribes. And only some of the tribal names are known. And supposedly, those separate tribes with separate languages finished to be formed only around 57th century. We don't know for sure. And here is one map of the known tribes. So you can see that here the area is smaller, and we don't know about the rest of the area. Those conclusions are made only by the linguistic sources, but there's nothing else because it's difficult to do other types of research. But this area that we know as the Baltic area was researched quite a lot, including archaeological findings, etc. And also there are written sources. So we know where Prussian people lived in the blue area, the west south. We know where Samogitians lived. We know where Curonian people lived. It's the purple area at the top. So, and there are even names of parts of the land of each tribe. Well, not each tribe. Some of the tribes we know the names of the lands of the tribe. This is the more commonly used map, and this is in English, so I thought it would work better. So you can see that there are differences between this map and the previous one, because in this map they put Samogitians bright green area and Lithuanians lighter green area separately. Here they say that Lithuanians were a common land, but they had areas of Samogitians and highland Lithuanians. I don't like Aukštaitians. I don't think it's right to say, but yeah. Okay. So this is what we know. And you can see that if we put the modern map of Lithuania on this map, that we live now in areas of several tribes. And the same goes for Latvia too. So there are two groups that we consider two groups of the Balts, Western Balts and Eastern Balts. So Lithuanians are Eastern Balts. There is also this notion of Dnieper Balts, but this name was created by researchers. There wasn't a name like that. We don't know. There was some ideas that maybe they were Galindians that who traveled there, and Dnieper is basically the territory of uh, Russia, and maybe some Baltic tribes that traveled there, or maybe there were peripheral Balts, but we don't have um, serious knowledge about that, serious sources about that, so that's that. And there were also other tribes that we now call periphery Balts. Only nations directly originating from the Balts are Lithuanians and Latvians, although, as I mentioned, the territories now cover lands of several tribes. Now, Prussian language, sorry for the typo, died in 17th century, but people are trying to recover it. So the only sources of Prussian language that we have are two vocabularies that were collected by Germans. So sometimes it's unclear if they use the right spelling, etc., etc. And we have three catechisms, so Christian literature, and that's that. So of course, it's not an indefinite source of words. So people who are trying to recover the language, they kind of made a distinction: original version of the language with a final number of the words, and then there is this new Prussian language, and they created new words based on what they have of Prussian and also comparing to other Baltic languages, meaning Lithuanian and Latvian. So actually, it's quite a process going on. They even have internet forums where they discuss impression. What we think about that? Well, I don't know. Maybe it's good that they are doing it. Of course, it's not the original thing, but they're trying. And as if we think that each language is something that adapts all the time and is altered all the time, maybe it's not that bad. Okay, so if we think about Western and Eastern Balts, so the idea is that Western and Eastern Baltic languages branched around 5th to 3rd centuries before Christ. So it is thought that they separated. Then different languages in each of the branches were formed around 5th to 7th century of, after Christ. So this is when Lithuanian was formed. It still wasn't the Lithuanian that we know today, and I'll tell you why in some moments. But this is when we think that Lithuanian language was formed. And there are some words actually that don't come from previously mentioned Proto-Indo-European. There are words in these Baltic languages that we know. So we know Lithuanian, we know Latvian, and we know some Prussian that have a word that's not shared with other Indo-European languages, only among the Baltic languages. So that's what connects them. So for example, the word tėvas, which means father, in Latvian it's tēvs, and in Prussian it's tavs. So there are these words that also kind of signify this connection between these Baltic languages. So what about being the oldest in Europe or the world or anywhere? It's not right to say that. We cannot say that.
And now we see that only around 5th to 7th centuries, Lithuanian language was formed. So why do we think that then? Why do we think that it's older? So of course, the previously mentioned reasons of fake stories, but also there is this linguist, Antanas Smetona, by the way, he shares the name with the president of the interwar period, but he's a linguist that is working now. So I listened to him saying that maybe it comes from the work of editors, because editors in Lithuania, they are quite strict with usage of some words, and it might be they didn't like some um, words being used for archaic, which is either archaiškas or senoviškas, and it might be that they edited those words into uh, something that means old, senas. So that's in Lithuanian language. So maybe some confusion came from that. I don't know if it's true. It's what he thinks. But also, of course, a lot of confusion can come from just not knowing the history and maybe not understanding the laws of language. And the truth is that Lithuanian language kept a lot of ancient forms from the Proto-Indo-European language. It did. And researchers use it to identify forms that existed even way before the Lithuanian language itself, because we kept some of the grammatical forms. If we think about dialects, in dialects we have even more of the ancient forms. For example, we have singular and plural in English. In Lithuanian too, well, typically, there are only pronouns that have the third number, which is dual. Sanskrit has dual. And there are some remains of dual forms in Lithuanian dialects. And they could be pronouns. And we have some dual pronouns in the modern Lithuanian language. But we don't have dual verbs in the modern language. But there are some dual verbs in the dialects. Now, there are two versions of how the dialects form. One version is that Samogitian started to be used at the same period when the tribes separated from the Eastern Balts, if we consider that Samogitians were a separate tribe. So around 57th century. Second version is that all Lithuanians spoke the same, and dialects known today separated only in 13th century. So there was this one of the most well-known linguists, Zigmas Zinkevičius, who thought the second. But now researchers of Samogitian language, they think that maybe not. Maybe Samogitian separated at the same time as Lithuanians, and that's when the language was formed, and only later they got closer. Because there are two ways that languages can be similar. It can be that they branch from the same place, or that maybe they branched, got separated, and then again came closer to each other, or that it's different, or that languages from different branches also came closer. So they think that maybe they came closer again after a while of being separated. And well, it's difficult to say. Usually the researchers who study and research Samogitian sometimes are looked at by other researchers with a grain of salt. But what can we say? We don't know for sure. We just can have an opinion. So if we talk about Lithuanian, now we have two main dialects. There's Aukštaitian, or the Highland dialect, and Samogitian. And again, if we talk about some auditions, if you know some Lithuanian and you can see the discussions online, you'll see that some people say, that some auditions were a separate nation and they had their language and that they had their history, and maybe Lithuanians stole some of that history. These are complicated topics, and we could argue till we are blue, and we will not reach a conclusion that is common between all peoples. It's just, I think it's impossible, and it's not worth arguing about it. We kind of understand that some magicians have their own identity, usually, or maybe not that much now, although there are very active groups that are working on it. Well, their work is not always accurate, but they are doing that. And, well, the land was mentioned in old sources as separate, Samogitia. That's why we have that name, because it was mentioned in the documents in Latin. But do we know how the language is actually formed? We have those two versions, and then we can choose. So now let's talk about the dialect. So you might have heard there are more dialects. So there are. It's just the scientific way of dividing them is that we have two main ones, and then we divide them into subdialects. But basically, Aukštaitija or Highland dialect, it actually branches into three main dialects: Western, Southern, and Eastern. And then we have those ethnographic regions: Suvalkija, Dzūkija, and Aukštaitija. It's not entirely exact to name them by the ethnographic region, because there is a distinction between naming the dialects and naming the regions. There is some inaccuracy in that, but just so we understand it easier. And all of those Western, Southern, and Eastern dialects are divided into subdialects. Now, Samogitian branches into three main groups. There are Western, there are Northern Kretinga and Northern Telšiai subdialects, and then there are Southern Varniai and Southern Raseiniai subdialects based on the locations. So this is the map of the division of the dialects, and it seems really complicated, but if you look at the sort of brownish area, that will be Samogitian. If you look at the pink area at the southern part, that will be Dzūkija dialect. And then if we look at this orange-yellow part, that's called Western Aukštaitija or Highland dialect. And then the rest of it, the purplish and greens, that's Eastern Aukštaitija dialect. So it's complicated, and the thing is that, and sometimes I ask researchers, professors, they say, well, why did they call this that? It doesn't make sense. But they said, where would you put them? Where would you put the specific subdialect? There's nowhere to put it, because they were affecting each other, and these areas between different dialects, they are kind of both black and white. It's no way to make a conclusion that everyone will be happy about. But basically, typically, we look at the map of the ethnographic regions and we kind of get the gist that this is how we understand that the dialects will be really different based on the areas of the ethnographic regions. So, yeah. Now, if we think about the history of the written words, the first Lithuanian book was published in 1547 by Mažvydas, and it was a catechism, and it was a Lutheran catechism, basically. And the thing is that he tried to write this book as clean as possible, but still when we analyze the text, it can be seen that he was a magician, and that there are these qualities and words that are used that let us understand that he was a magician. Now, what about before? We know that this was the first use of Lithuanian written language. Well, before that, we only have sources from others. That's why it's not entirely accurate. We say that we can make a conclusion, but we cannot say it's a fact. Now, of course, a very important part of the history of the language was Reformation and Counter-Reformation. Sorry for the typo again. Why? Well, Reformation happened, and they started adhering to this idea that people need to be able to understand the word of God in their own language. And of course, Catholics couldn't just stay behind. They needed to react, so that's how they started publishing books in Lithuanian too. So basically, one of the main conflicts in the history between churches was the engine of Lithuanian words being used in written form. And from the start of the written Lithuanian word, authors, they tried, as I said, to create a higher version of the language, but they still wrote in their dialects. And the variations of the written language typically are divided into three, and we are talking about 16th, 17th centuries. So they are kind of not divided into dialects, but there were these variations of the language that were used. So there was Eastern variation, which comes from Vilnius area. There was the middle variation that comes from Žemeikytė, although Žemeikytė was a very different territory than the modern ethnographic region. And then we have Western, which is Lithuania Minor. So that variation. And it was in the Duchy of Prussia. Now, after 1705, when Polonization kind of took over Vilnius area, the Eastern variation kind of disappeared, and religious books started to be rewritten into the middle variation, so Žemaikytė. So for a long time, it was the main language of the books. Now, Eastern Lithuanians, they wrote in the mixture of the local dialects, but a lot less. Books in Western Aukštaitija dialect started to be written in 19th century. And Lithuania Minor actually became the center of the Lithuanian written word because of the ban of Lithuanian press. And it's interesting because Lithuanian schools were forbidden there, but majority of the books got printed in that area, so in Prussia. And what happened? Well, after the second uprising of 1853 to 64, the Lithuanian press was banned. But the interesting thing is that the problem wasn't the Lithuanian language. Another interesting thing is that it wasn't even announced like legally in the form of laws. This news was just spread through messengers that it's now forbidden to print in Lithuanian. Why? Because the problem was actually Polish. And as Lithuanian used the same alphabet, which was, well, Latin alphabet, and the manner of putting the letters together so that the sounds would be formed, the correct ones, was similar. They said, okay, you can use Lithuanian. You just need to use Cyrillic. You need to print your books in Cyrillic alphabet so that it doesn't resemble Polish. So there were actually even these tricks that they used. Like they said, okay, we'll stop using W because we will just use letter V because that's what we need. We don't need W. And if you don't want us to be Polish, we won't because we don't need it. and Polish keep using W. And that was one of the tricks, they would print the books by signing them by nicknames, and they would also print the books and saying that this book was published like 20 years ago, for example. So they would do all those things, and of course they would smuggle the books from Lithuania Minor, etc. So we might think, so what's the harm, just change the alphabet. And at first, there were people who thought that, even from the, cultural workers. They thought, okay, well, this is what they want. But after a while, they started understanding that they are losing the language because the phonetic, um, there were phonetic problems because the words would get distorted if you read. They had these vocabularies, and of Lithuanian words in Cyrillic, and when you read them, you see that you pronounce those words completely differently than when they are written in Latin. And I think only 50 to 60 books were published in Cyrillic and in Lithuanian language. And the secret process of the books being published resulted in 2,000 books. You can imagine it was a really, really active process. And in the 19th century, researchers and writers started trying to create the common language. Well, the problem was that everyone suggested their own subdialects. And by the second half, the movement of national revival became more active, and the common language was needed more than ever. So they still needed, the language. So there was this professor, whose name was Jonas Jablonskis, who is considered the creator of the modern Lithuanian language. So in 1901, he published a book, Lithuanian Language Grammar. He signed it by a fake name, well, because it was still the period of the press being forbidden. And it was printed in Lithuania Minor, of course, and this is considered kind of the start of the modern Lithuanian language. All, of course, it was still improved. They kept improving it, and it was fully established only in the interwar period. It was based on, well, supposedly on Suvalkija dialect, Kaunas area subdialect, although it's probably not entirely right to say that because the written variation was based on the Lithuania Minor area. So it was kind of created. Everything was put together in that way. Although Jonas Jablonskis was from Kaunas area subdialect. And there were also other people who participated in the movement who were from that area. Other linguists also worked on it. One of them was Kazimieras Būga, who helped in the later period to establish it. So the thing is that your ancestors, they didn't speak the language that you hear now as Lithuanian, because the Lithuanian language, as we know it today, even it was slightly different even then, but still, it's the closest that we speak today. Closest to what we speak today was this, the created modern language, and your ancestors spoke in their own dialect. So now if we speak about the age of languages, so what do we say? What is the age of Lithuanian? Do we consider when it branched originally, or do we consider the age of the modern language? Do we consider what? So actually, we cannot give an exact age of a living language. Even of the languages that are extinct now, well, they were living languages, they weren't just created at a specific point in time. So actually, the exception would be the artificial languages, Esperanto, for example, because we know an exact date when it was announced, when it was created. And with the living languages, they keep changing, they keep altering. And we have no way of saying that, so okay, on this day, on this year, this language was this years old. It's just impossible. Now, another thing that is commonly talked about is that Lithuanian language is the most similar to Sanskrit. So I just want to point this out, that if you look at the language tree, we followed the cat to the Baltic branch, yes. And now if you look at the branch on the left in the Iranian, and then we move to Indo-Aryan to Indic languages. So this is where we'll find Sanskrit. It's like a separate, really small branch above the word Indic. So we kind of understand that they are in completely different branches of the same Indo-European language tree. What does that mean? So basically, I just want to give you a few facts. I have studied Sanskrit, to be honest, a little bit. I'm definitely not fluent, and mostly it is now used as a written language. There are speakers, but it's there are even several variations of it. But the classic school of Sanskrit is that you kind of learn to read it. Of course, you learn to write it, but you learn not for speaking, but for understanding, for analyzing the old writings. So this is how the letters look like. They're called Devanagari, which means the town of gods, this specific type of writing. And it is a completely different phonetic system than we are used to. They have vowels, they have consonants. But for example, if we're looking at the consonants, they will always include a vowel in them. So the default is a sound, but if you want another vowel, you need to add additional symbol so that it's, for example, not ka, but let's say ki, right? So of course, it's just in a nutshell so that you can see how many variations in the sound system. Now, you probably have seen those lists where they compare words between Lithuanian and Sanskrit. And I must say that they have a lot of mistakes usually, and people are trying to adapt the words so that they would mean a more similar thing. Yes, there are words that have the same roots because those languages both are from the same Indo-European language family. But the thing is that most of the words, they are different. And I just picked a picture that I had from an old workbook. And you can see that, for example, Rajan meaning king. So in Lithuanian, it's completely different word, karalius, for example. Naman is more similar to English, which is name, than in Lithuanian, it's vardas. So, well, it's not that Lithuanians can understand Sanskrit and people who understand Sanskrit can understand Lithuanian, because sometimes you'll see those comments, and yeah, it's not correct to say that. And sometimes even people from India, I don't know why they do that. They say, like, my Lithuanian wife understands my parents. Well, maybe they're trying really hard and they are comparing some of the words. But it's not that they will understand full sentences in complex, native speech. And the thing is that everything from word formation to the sentence structure is different, similarly as to English and to Lithuanian, if we compare them to Sanskrit. And one of the main processes that's going on is called Sanhi, which is the change of the primary word form when words are put together in a sentence, let's say, in a chain of speech. So each word affects each other where they meet, and they sometimes connect or the sounds change. And if you don't know the language really well, you will not recognize those words anymore because the sounds change. Also, another process that's going on is that meaning of the words changes based on the context of the sentence. So I just wanted to show you that it's a different system even. Yes, we have old grammatical categories. And as Sanskrit was kind of set in time, it was locked in time. And as Lithuanian is supposedly kept many ancient forms, we'll find those similarities, but not because they are closest to each other. It's just because they are maybe closest in the sense that they have those old forms. But if we need to name a closest language for Lithuanian, of course it will be what? Latvian, because we are, well, sister or brother languages, whatever we call it, we are in the very same branch, Baltic languages, and that's it. So yeah, it's also, and when you go and you go to study Sanskrit here, my old professor, the first sentence that he said when we came to the very first lecture was, no, Lithuanian and Sanskrit are not the same. You'll not understand Sanskrit just because you're Lithuanian, because that's what people think. And you need to study the language to understand that this isn't true. Yeah. And on that note, languages, they are alive, and language as a concept, we think about the language is thing that is alive. It keeps changing, it keeps being altered, it keeps adapting. And to really understand how it works, we need to have something to compare it to. So maybe, study languages of the same branch, study languages from the same family, start comparing them. And that's when you actually get this excitement of understanding that, okay, this is how it works. This is how they might have formed. This is where we come from. And of course, Lithuanian language is wonderful. It's rich. It kept all those ancient forms. And we should be proud of our heritage. But only that we need to know the real facts, which we can be proud of. Not just, those fake stories that keep floating around and we need to argue about them. We don't. We need to actually get to know our culture. We need to actually get to know our language and then be proud about them. Be proud of them. And, this is where the root comes from. And this is where our deep understanding of our roots comes from. So this is how I feel. And I just wanted to share this with you so that maybe it can be a beginning of the process of learning more about the language. Even maybe if you don't know the language, or if you are trying to learn it, or maybe you might not learn it, but maybe you will want to learn about it, how it came to be, and why is it special for real. So that's my wish. Now, if we have questions, we can discuss them. So yeah, let's spend some minutes talking about your ideas, or maybe you want to ask something. So feel free to do so now. And I'll read the comment that we had. I came in late to the conversation. I used to be a meeting planner and would have the conference materials printed in the city where the conference was being held. Worked out great. yeah, I think I'm going to need to look into that with the cards. I feel they are useful, for people. At least here locally, people are happy about them. I just, wasn't able to think of a way of actually making that happen in the States. Maybe I'm going to need to do that. Yeah. So if any of you have an idea of where it could be done, let me know. Okay, just email me, and maybe I will be able to look into that. So do we have any questions, or do you want to say something? I didn't know that the name of rivers didn't change. Was that worldwide? Um, it's not that they didn't change at all, that they changed the least. Because, well, it wasn't important to change the names of the rivers, for example. It was important to change the names of the towns, during all those political changes where they were fighting, for uh, for power, etc., etc. And yeah, they changed the list, and I think that should be a worldwide process. I haven't studied other areas, but it's kind of the main principle that the names of the water sources they change the least. Okay, so while we're waiting, if anyone else wants to say something or express an idea or something, just comment. And I wanted to remind you that 11th of April we are talking about Lithuanian food, and 12th of April we are talking about Lithuanian festivals. And if you have an idea of what you would like to hear about, can let me know. And also, I am now in the process of thinking of other topics that could be discussed in the future lectures for people who want to continue learning and maybe participating in the classes online. So if you have an idea you would like to hear about, like a topic, anything, you can either email me, or I have started a post in our Facebook community group, Genealogy, and you can also add your answer there to the poll, and we'll see. Because I had some ideas, but I think people have some other ideas, and we'll see where that leads us. But yeah, I'll announce some new topics in the near future. But meanwhile, we are talking about food and the festivals. And the festival one was actually pretty successful in the past, so hopefully that will happen again, and you will learn something new. So let me know if this lecture was useful for you or interesting, or if it will lead you to trying to research more. And yeah, I'll see you then in 2 weeks now, because next weekend is Easter. And in the beginning, actually, you might remember that I made this mistake of uh, planning a lecture on Easter because I didn't look at the calendar when the Easter is happening this year. But we changed it. So again, 11th and 12th. Okay, it was interesting. Good. Then I'm happy. This is the hot topic, and I received a lot of interesting comments about that. I was telling you about it, but hopefully, it was an opportunity to hear more about it, because I understand that sometimes maybe it's difficult to reach um, reliable resources. And there is a lot of information around this nowadays, all over social media where we spend a lot of time, and etc. And sometimes even it's reshared. That information is reshared even in the places where it should be reliable. Like I found an excerpt from that fake article in a local school workbook. And they just took it from the internet and they used it as a reliable source for school students to learn about Lithuanian language. So sometimes that information, it becomes unstoppable. And then you don't know how to choose what is right and what is not. So hopefully, it can be a starting point to research more and read more and understand how the language works. Okay, so I wish you to have a very nice day, and we'll meet again soon. So, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.